I found the body on the morning of September 4th, and it wasn't dead. That's the part I still have trouble saying out loud. Not because it sounds impossible, but because the alternative, that I misread what I saw, means I can't trust any observation I've made in the 14 months since. And I was a good observer. That was the whole job. My name is Aaron Lacefield. In the fall of 2017, I was 26 months into a resource management position with the National Park Service at Yellowstone, stationed out of the Bechler River Ranger Station in the park's remote southwest corner. If you've been to Yellowstone, you probably haven't been to Bechler. Most visitors enter through West Yellowstone or Gardner, drive the Grand Loop, watch Old Faithful, and leave. The Bechler district sits below the Pitchstone Plateau in a drainage system fed by snowmelt and thermal runoff, accessible by a single unpaved road out of Ashton, Idaho. We serviced about 3% of the park's total backcountry traffic. Some weeks in September, I was the only ranger in the district. My duties were straightforward: trail condition reports, backcountry permit verification, campsite inspections along the Bechler River and Falls River corridors, water quality sampling at 6 thermal outflow points, bear activity documentation. I carried a radio, a sidearm, and a GPS unit that lost satellite lock in about 40% of the terrain I covered. I knew the trail system the way you know your own kitchen. Not from maps, but from repetition. The Bechler Meadows Trail runs 9 miles from the ranger station to a junction where it splits toward Bechler Falls to the south and the Boundary Creek Corridor to the northwest. It's flat for the first 4 miles, crossing open meadow on a raised boardwalk that floods reliably in June. Then it enters timber, lodgepole pine, standing dead from the 88 fires mixed with 30-year regrowth, and stays in trees for the remaining 5 miles, broken only by 2 creek crossings and a marshy section near the 9B2 campsite. I walked that trail, in whole or in part, probably 300 times in my first 2 years, and in September of 2017, something began using it on a schedule I could set a clock by. The body was a cow elk. She was lying on her left side, approximately 40 yards off trail, east of the path between the 9B2 and 9B4 campsites, in a depression between 2 downed lodgepole trunks. I found her at 7:40 in the morning during a routine campsite check. The temperature was 31 degrees. There had been frost overnight. She was intact. No visible wounds, no blood, no sign of predation, scavenging, or struggle. Her eyes were open and clear. Her coat was clean. Her legs were positioned naturally, as though she had laid down to rest. Her abdomen was not distended. There was no odor, and she was breathing. I watched her ribcage rise and fall for about 90 seconds. The rhythm was slow, maybe 4 breaths per minute, which is roughly half the resting rate for an adult cow elk. I noted this. I circled wide to check for a calf or other animals nearby. Nothing. I radioed the district office in Old Faithful, which managed our communications relay, and reported a downed elk at my GPS coordinates. The dispatcher, a woman named Connie Brask, asked if the animal appeared injured. I said no. She asked if it was responsive. I approached to about 15 feet and spoke. The elk did not move. Her eyes did not track me. I told Connie the animal appeared comatose. She said she would relay to the wildlife biology team and advised me to flag the location and continue my route. I tied orange surveyor's tape to a branch at the trailside and moved on. When I returned along the same trail 6 hours later, the elk was gone. The tape was still there. The depression where she'd been lying still held the impression of her body in the frost-killed grass. but there were no tracks leading away from it. Not hers, not anything's. I noted this in my evening report. I did not flag it as unusual because at that point it wasn't. Elk stand up and walk away. Frost sublimates. Tracks in dry grass aren't always legible. Every piece of it had a reasonable explanation. I filed the report and made dinner. 3 days later, on September 7th, I found her again. Same location, same position, same side, same orientation, same shallow depression between the same two downed trunks. Left side down, legs relaxed, eyes open and clear, breathing at that same reduced rate. This time I photographed her. I had a department-issued digital camera I used for trail damage documentation, and I took 11 photographs from multiple angles, including close shots of her eye, her nostrils, and the ground immediately surrounding her body. In every image, she looked like a healthy animal resting in an unusual place. Except she would not wake up. I radioed Connie again. She pulled up my earlier report and asked if I was certain it was the same animal. I told her I was looking at the same elk in the same depression between the same two logs. And unless the Bechler district had a second perfectly healthy cow elk that liked to nap in the same spot without waking up? Yes, I was certain. She said she'd push the wildlife referral again. Nobody came. The Bechler district in September is a low priority for a biology team managing elk rut activity, wolf pack surveys, and bison grazing conflicts across 2 million acres. A sleeping elk 40 yards off a backcountry trail in a drainage most biologists hadn't visited in a year was not going to move anyone's schedule. I went back the next morning. She was gone again. Same clean depression. Same absence of departure tracks. On September 11th, she was back. I didn't radio it in the third time. I sat on a downed log about 25 feet away, ate a granola bar, and watched her for 40 minutes. Her breathing was metronomic. 4 breaths per minute. I timed it against my watch. 4 breaths every 60 seconds, without a single variation across the entire observation period. Not a flicker of her ear, not a twitch of her tail. Her eyes stayed open and fixed on nothing. I stood up, walked a slow perimeter around her at 15 feet, and for the first time looked carefully at the ground between her body and the trail. The grass was dry. The soil was a mix ophyte and mixed silt, typical for the meadow to timber transition in that part of the drainage. And in the softer patches, about 10 feet from her body on the trail side, I found tracks. Not elk tracks. Not bear, not wolf, not moose, not bison, not human. They were round, slightly concave, pressed into the soil about a 1/4 inch deep, roughly 4 inches in diameter, evenly spaced, about 28 inches apart, in a straight line that ran from the trail toward the elk and then curved around behind her before the soil got too firm to hold an impression. I photographed these as well. 17 photographs. I measured the depth, the spacing, and the diameter with a tape measure from my pack. I sketched the layout in my field notebook. The line of impressions was consistent with a bipedal gait. Left, right, but the shape was wrong for any boot or shoe. They were perfectly circular. No tread, no heel differentiation, no toe push, just round depressions, evenly applied, as though someone had walked toward the elk, pressing a soup can into the dirt with each step. I flagged this in my evening report with the photographs attached as an addendum. I described them as unidentified impressions and requested a wildlife biologist or a law enforcement ranger visit the site. The response from Old Faithful the following morning was a single line from the district supervisor. Received. Will schedule when available. The elk was gone on September 12th. Back on the 15th. Gone on the 16th. Back on the 19th, I logged every occurrence. The pattern was irregular at first, but by late September, after 5 cycles, I could see the shape of it. She appeared every 3rd or 4th day. She was always in the same position. She was always breathing at the same rate. She was always gone within 24 hours. And the circular tracks were always present, following the same path from the trail to her body, and curving around behind her, as though something had walked to her, inspected her, and then continued around and away into the timber. On September 22nd, I did something I had been avoiding. I deviated from the trail and followed the circular tracks past the elk and into the trees. They continued for about 60 yards through the lodgepole, maintaining that 28-inch spacing, that perfect left-right alternation, that uniform 4-inch diameter. The soil under the canopy was softer, layered with needle duff, and the impressions were slightly deeper there, maybe 3/8 of an inch. They did not vary. They did not stumble. They did not pause. They moved through the timber in a gradual curve that bent south, and then, at a point I marked with GPS, they stopped. Not faded, not transitioned to harder ground. The last impression was the same depth as the first. The ground ahead was the same soft needle duff, perfectly capable of holding a track. But there were no more. Whatever made them had either stopped walking or stopped being there. I stood at that final track for a while. The timber around me was standing dead and regrowth mixed together. Gray trunks and green ones, nothing moving. No wind. No sound except the distant white noise of Bechler River, maybe a quarter-mile west. The morning was cold and clear and completely still. I walked back to the trail and continued my route. On September 25th, the elk was in a different position. For the first time in 3 weeks, something had changed. She was still in the same depression, still between the same 2 downed trunks. But she was on her right side. Her legs were in the same relaxed arrangement. Her eyes were open and clear. Her breathing was 4 per minute. But she had been turned over, or she had turned herself, and the grass beneath where her left side had been, for every prior visit, was yellow and compressed in the exact outline of her body. A silhouette pressed into the meadow like a snow angel in dry grass. I photographed the outline. I photographed her new orientation. Then I walked the perimeter again, looking for the circular tracks. They were there, following the same path from the trail. But this time, the line didn't curve around behind her. It went straight to her body and stopped. The last track was less than 2 feet from her ribcage. I crouched there and looked at the elk's face. Her eye was large and dark and wet and absolutely empty. I could see myself reflected in it. I spoke to her. I said her name. I had started calling her 9 Bravo after the campsite designation, and I said it clearly, and her eye did not move. Her breathing did not change. 4 breaths, 60 seconds, mechanical. I put my hand on her side. Her coat was warm. Her heartbeat was strong and slow, maybe 30 beats per minute. I could feel each one distinctly through her ribs. I pulled my hand back and looked at the circular impression 2 feet away. The soil inside it was dry. The edges were clean. It looked deliberate. I had the thought. The first one I couldn't file under any professional heading, that whatever made these tracks had come to check on her. October arrived, and the nights dropped into the teens. The first hard freeze came on October 3rd, and when I walked the Bechler Meadows Trail on the 4th, the boardwalk sections were glazed with ice. The seasonal staff had mostly departed. I was running the station alone on weekdays, with a law enforcement ranger named Dale Purcell covering weekends from a camp he maintained near Cascade Corner. Dale was 54, former military, not much for conversation. He knew the Bechler district better than I did, which is the only reason I asked him about it. I didn't tell him about the elk at first. I described the tracks. Round, 4 inches, uniform depth, uniform spacing, no tread pattern. I asked if he'd ever seen anything like that in his years in the district. Dale was sitting in the station's front room, cleaning his service weapon, which he did every Sunday with a kind of liturgical focus. He didn't look up. He asked where I'd found them. I told him. The 9B2 to 9B4 corridor, timber section, east of the trail. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "How far did you follow them?" I told him about 60 yards, to where they stopped. "They always stop," he said. He set down the boar brush. "How long have you been seeing them?" I told him since early September. He asked if I'd seen anything else. I hesitated, and that hesitation was apparently enough, because he looked at me for the first time in the conversation and said, "The elk." I felt something shift in my chest that I don't have a good word for. It wasn't fear. It was the sensation of a private experience suddenly becoming shared in a way that made it more real and less controllable. Dale told me he'd first seen the tracks in 2011. Same section of trail, same circular impressions, same measurements, same pattern of appearing and disappearing. He'd followed them once, further than I had, nearly a quarter mile through the timber, and they'd ended the same way. Last track, identical to the first, ground ahead, perfectly capable of holding more. Nothing there. He said he'd seen the elk too, but not the same elk. His had been a bull, a young one, lying in a drainage wash about 100 yards north of where I'd been finding 9 Bravo. Same presentation. Breathing, eyes open, unresponsive. It had appeared and disappeared on a roughly 3-day cycle throughout September and into October of 2011. How did it end? I asked. Dale picked up the boar brush again and resumed cleaning. First hard frost that year was October 9th, he said. Went out on the 10th. Bull was gone. Tracks were gone. Didn't come back. He didn't say anything else about it, and the way he returned to his work made it clear the conversation was over. But at the door, as I was leaving, he said one more thing, without looking up. "Don't touch her again." I didn't ask him how he knew I had. October 5th, October 8th, October 11th. 9 Bravo continued her cycle. I continued logging it. I no longer radioed the sightings. My reports went into my field notebook and a personal journal I kept at the station. The official reports I filed mentioned trail conditions, campsite status, and bear activity. I left the elk out. I'm not proud of that. I understand now that I was protecting something. Not the elk, not the phenomenon, but my own access to it. I had become proprietary about 9 Bravo, in a way that didn't feel unhealthy at the time, but that I now recognize as the first structural change in how I was thinking. I wasn't investigating anymore. I was maintaining a relationship. On October 14th, I deviated from my routine. Instead of walking the trail in the morning, I hiked in after dark. I left the station at 9 p.m. with a headlamp, my sidearm, a radio, and a thermos of coffee. The temperature was 19 degrees. The sky was clear. No moon. The stars so dense they cast a faint ambient light across the meadow sections. I reached the 9B2 area at approximately 10:45 p.m. and turned off my headlamp. I found a position on a blowdown about 40 yards from 9 Bravo's depression, on the opposite side of the trail from where she appeared. I could see the gap between the 2 downed trunks, where she always lay. The depression was empty. I sat down, poured coffee, and waited. At 1:15 in the morning, the temperature dropped. I don't mean it got colder. I mean I felt the cold change character. The air had been still and dry, the kind of high-altitude October cold that sits on your skin evenly. What replaced it was localized and wet, a pocket of air, maybe 10 degrees colder than the surrounding environment that moved across me from left to right, from the direction of the trail, over a period of about 5 seconds. It passed over me and continued toward the depression. I did not turn on my headlamp. I sat still and watched. I couldn't see anything. The starlight gave me the shape of the timber, the outlines of the downed trunks, the pale stripe of the trail. But the area between the trail and the depression was a dark mass of shadow where the canopy blocked the sky. I heard footsteps. They were soft, rhythmic, evenly spaced. They sounded like a person walking at a moderate pace through dry grass, that papery whisper of stems brushing against something solid. They came from the trail and moved toward the depression. The rhythm was steady. Left, right, left, right. The spacing matched what I'd measured in the tracks. 28 inches. They stopped. I sat perfectly still. My coffee thermos was capped. My hands were in my lap. The footsteps had stopped at a point I estimated was directly adjacent to the depression, roughly where I'd found the circular tracks terminate on the morning when 9 Bravo had been turned to her right side. Then I heard breathing. Not my own. Not an elk's slow 4-per-minute rhythm. This was faster, maybe 12 breaths per minute, and it had a quality I struggled to articulate. It sounded thick, effortful, as though whatever was breathing had the physical capacity for it but was doing it deliberately. The way you might breathe if you were imitating the act rather than performing it autonomously. Each inhale had a faint catch at the top, a tiny wet click, and each exhale was slightly too controlled, slightly too even, as though metered. This lasted for about 4 minutes. Then the footsteps resumed, continuing past the depression and into the timber, following the same curved path the circular tracks always took. They faded over maybe 30 seconds and then were gone. I did not move for another hour. The cold pocket did not return. The normal ambient temperature reasserted itself gradually, and by 2:30 a.m. the air around me felt uniform again. I turned on my headlamp, walked to the depression, and looked. 9 Bravo was there. She was on her left side, original position, breathing at 4 per minute, eyes open, coat clean and warm. She had not been there when I arrived. She had not been there when the footsteps passed. But she was there now. I walked to the trail side of the depression and pointed my headlamp at the ground. The circular tracks were fresh. They ran from the trail to the depression in a straight line, and this time there was a second set leading away. The curved path into the timber. 2 trips, in and out, and between them the elk had appeared. I went back to the station. I did not sleep. I sat at the desk and transcribed my observations in the kind of detail I hadn't used since my thesis fieldwork, precise and clinical, because the clinical language was the only thing keeping the experience in a category I could manage. I went back the next morning. 9 Bravo was gone. The circular tracks were there, both sets. I photographed them in daylight. In the photographs, they looked like what they are. Round, uniform depressions in soft soil, leading to and from a spot where a 600-pound animal materialized in the night. Dale came through on October 18th for his weekend shift. I told him what I'd done. He was angry, genuinely angry, the only time I ever saw that from him. He didn't raise his voice. He set down his coffee mug on the station counter and stared at me and said, "You sat out there in the dark." I said, "Yes." "And you heard it?" "Yes. And now you want to go back." I didn't answer because the honest answer was yes, And the honest answer frightened me more than anything I'd heard in the timber. Dale read it on my face. "That's how it works," he said. "You don't understand that yet, but you will. The elk isn't stuck. The elk is bait." He said it flatly, without drama, the way he said everything. He told me that in 2011, after his bull elk had disappeared, following the first hard frost, he'd thought it was over. But the next September, the tracks came back. No elk that year, just the tracks, running their circuit from the trail into the timber. He'd followed them further than before, almost half a mile, and they'd ended the same way. And at the termination point, standing in the timber where the last track pressed into the duff, he'd felt the cold pocket I described. Wet, localized, moving past him. "Something touched my shoulder," he said. "I'm not speculating about what. I'm telling you that I felt a physical pressure on my left shoulder from behind for approximately 2 seconds, and then it was gone. I was wearing a patrol jacket and a base layer. It came through both." He said he'd never gone back to that section of trail after dark. He adjusted his patrol schedule to clear the 9B2 to 9B4 corridor by 3 p.m. every day. He filed his reports on trail conditions and bear scat, same as always, and left the rest out. "The Park Service doesn't have a form for this," he said, "and whatever is using that trail doesn't need us to fill one out." I wanted to ask him a dozen questions: what he thought it was, whether he'd told anyone else, whether the tracks had come back in 2012, 2013, the years between, whether the elk was always the same species or always different, whether the 4-per-minute breathing was consistent across his observation and mine, whether the circular tracks had ever appeared anywhere else in the district. But Dale had picked up his mug and walked to the front porch, and the conversation was over the same way it had begun, with a boundary he enforced through silence. The first hard frost came on October 21st. The morning of October 22nd, I walked the trail to 9 Bravo's depression. She was gone. The grass in the depression was uniformly brown and flat, compressed by weeks of her recurring weight, a perfect elk-shaped shadow pressed into the meadow. The circular tracks were present but shallow, barely visible, as though the last set had been made with less weight or less conviction. I followed them into the timber one last time. They ran their usual 60 yards and curved south. But this time, they didn't stop. They continued, fainter, shallower, but legible in the soft duff, for another 200 yards through the lodgepole. The spacing was the same. The diameter was the same. But the depth decreased gradually, impression by impression, as though whatever was walking was becoming lighter or less present with each step. The last track was a ghost, a faint circular shadow in the needles, barely distinguishable from the natural unevenness of the forest floor. I almost missed it. Beyond it, the ground was undisturbed. I stood there and listened. No cold pocket, no breathing, no sound at all except the river, distant and constant. The timber was lit by mid-morning sun, the dead trunks silver, the regrowth bright green, everything sharp-edged and ordinary. I marked the GPS coordinates of the final track. I walked back to the trail. I hiked to the station and filed my last report of the season. Trail conditions deteriorating. Seasonal closure recommended. No incidents of note. I left the Bechler station on November 1st. My transfer to a position at Grant Village had been approved in August, a move I'd requested before any of this began, for career reasons that had nothing to do with elk or circular tracks or sounds in the dark. I want to be precise about what happened next, because the impulse is to build it into something bigger than it was. What happened was quiet. What happened fit inside normal life so neatly that I could almost pretend it wasn't happening. In December, I was living in park housing near Grant Village, working winter operations. Road assessments, snow coach, permits, the reduced rhythms of Yellowstone's interior when the tourists are gone and the snow covers everything. I had a small apartment in a converted dormitory building. Shared kitchen, private bedroom. I kept to myself mostly, ran the wood stove in the evenings, read, went to bed early. On December 9th, I came home from a 12-hour shift and found a track on my doorstep. One track, circular, 4 inches in diameter, pressed into the thin layer of snow that had accumulated on the concrete step during the day. A 1/4 inch deep, clean edges, no tread. No accompanying tracks anywhere nearby. Not on the walkway, not on the stairs, not in the parking area. One single impression, centered on my doorstep, as though something had taken a single step and stopped, or had stood in one place without shifting its weight. I looked at it for a long time. The snow around it was unbroken. My own boot prints from that morning led away from the door and down the stairs. Nothing had approached from any direction. The track was simply there, placed the way the elk had been placed in her depression, appearing between observations without a visible mechanism of arrival. I went inside. I locked the door. I sat on the edge of my bed and thought very carefully about what I was going to do with the rest of my evening. Because what I wanted to do was go back outside and measure it, photograph it, document the snow conditions and the temperature and the absence of surrounding tracks. I wanted to collect data, and I recognized, with a clarity that felt borrowed from Dale Purcell, that the data collection was the point, that whatever had been using the Bechler Meadows Trail had not followed me 60 miles north through Yellowstone's interior in December because it wanted to be near me. It had left a single track in a place where I would find it because it wanted to know if I would come outside. I did not go back outside. In the morning, the track was gone. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, barely a dusting, but the step was uniformly covered. I checked. I couldn't help checking, and there was no trace of the impression. I went to work. It happened twice more that winter. January 14th, a track on the hood of my truck, pressed into road salt dust so cleanly I could see the circular outline from my apartment window. February 2nd, a track on the wooden railing of the dormitory staircase, pressed into frost, disappearing by noon. Each time a single impression. Each time 4 inches, 1/4 inch depth, no tread, no surrounding evidence. Each time I found it and did not go to it. I noted the date and the location in my personal journal and went about my day. I want to be honest about what that discipline cost me. Not going to the track on my truck, not walking down the stairs, crossing the parking lot, and pressing my finger into the salt dust to feel the edges of the impression was one of the harder things I've done. Not because I was afraid, because I was curious in a way that didn't feel like my own curiosity. It felt placed the same way the track was placed. It fit exactly into the space where my professional instincts lived, the part of me that measured and documented and followed evidence to its source. And I understood. The way you understand a trail you've walked 300 times, that following this particular evidence wasn't going to lead to a source. It was going to lead to a depression in the ground between 2 downed logs. And I was going to lie down in it. And my breathing was going to slow to 4 beats per minute. And my eyes were going to stay open and fixed on nothing. I left Yellowstone in March of 2018. I took a position with the Forest Service in Colorado, then left federal service entirely in 2020. I work for a county parks department now, in a place I'm not going to name, maintaining trail bridges and drainage culverts. It's good work. Small work. I don't carry a GPS and I don't file field reports. Dale Purcell retired in 2019. I know this because I called the Bechler station the following September, and the seasonal, who answered, said Dale had not returned. I asked if there was anything unusual on the trail between the 9B2 and 9B4 campsites. The seasonal said he hadn't been out there yet. I told him to let me know if he noticed anything, and left my number. He never called. I think about 9 Bravo more than I should. Not with fear, with something worse. The feeling of an unfinished study, a data set abandoned before the pattern resolved. I know what she was. She was a lure calibrated to the exact frequency of a person who can't leave a question unanswered. The tracks, the breathing, the 3-day cycle, the single displaced impression on a doorstep in December. All of it was a sequential test. Each one slightly closer, slightly more personal, slightly more dependent on my willingness to engage. And the part I can't resolve is this. I don't know if stopping was the right choice. I don't know if whatever walks that trail in September is hostile or neutral, or something I don't have a category for. I don't know if 9 Bravo was suffering, or sleeping, or already gone. I don't know if Dale's bull elk woke up somewhere and walked back into the herd, or if it's still lying in a depression I'll never find, breathing 4 times a minute for years now, waiting for someone to do what I wouldn't. Last September, I was replacing a footbridge on a creek trail about 800 miles from Yellowstone. It was a warm day, early in the month, and I was working alone. I set my tools down around 2 in the afternoon and walked to the creek to wash my hands. There was a track on the bank, one, circular, 4 inches, pressed into the wet sand at the waterline. Clean edges, no surrounding impressions. The creek moved past it without touching it. The water curving around the depression the way water curves around a stone that's been there a long time. I work at a ranger station in Yellowstone. Something keeps returning to the same trail. I dried my hands on my pants. I picked up my tools. I walked back to my truck and drove home and did not write it down. But I'm telling you now, and I need you to understand that telling you is the same kind of test, the same mechanism, the same carefully placed impression in the one soft place where you can't help but look at it. I know that. I'm telling you anyway, because the alternative is carrying it alone. And I've learned what that does. It makes a depression in you. It gives something a place to rest. And once the shape is there, pressed into the grass where no one else can see it, the only question left is how long before you lie down in it. I don't go into the field after dark anymore. I don't follow tracks. I don't sit still in timber and listen for breathing that isn't mine. But every September, I check the ground outside my door in the morning. And so far, it's been clean. So far.